The Particular Abilities of Marinette and Her Discovery of Them by Plants Are Fun 06. A Miraculous Ladybug, Batman, crossover fanfic. Chapter 2. A Meadow and Some Tears. If Marinette's teeth weren't chattering so much under the cold, it would be possible for her to speak, and the only word she would say would be, "Thank you, Grandfather." Marinette knew without a doubt that it was because of him and his harsh expectations that she was alive. That those expectations he gave her are the only reason her body isn't frozen solid over some random snowbank near the gates of Nandam Parbat, later to be eaten by local wildlife. Only 1 month ago, Grandfather had ordered a training exercise of Marinette, where she had to trek down, then back up the mountain that Nandam Part rested on. And that was no average trek, not one they had for standard training of the assassins of the League of Shadows, let alone a child. No, she would have to do the trek up and down the mountain, blindfolded. A training exercise of this level would typically only be assigned in someone's training after years of preparation and previous exercises similar to such a feat, including previous treks down and up the mountain. And that was if they ever were assigned to do such a task. Whereas Marinette was a 3-year-old girl, whose physical training was limited to learning proper stretching poses, the basic forms and stances of judo and kung fu, and had just recently learned how to do a proper cartwheel. Not exactly the years of training and experience you would expect to have undergone previously to being assigned to trek a mountain blindfolded. After hearing about the new training assignment, she was very aware that preparation was necessary. Marinette thoroughly studied the mountain and every single one of its features for an entire week before a handmaid came into Marinette's chambers to provide her with the gear she was allowed, and to inform her that a tutor was waiting at the exterior gate to begin the exercise, and to not keep him waiting. Last trek, she was able to remember every single one of the route's features, as long as she counted her steps. Her feet were exactly 6 inches, and after practice, she was able to fix her gait to be a perfect foot. She would be okay. Marinette knew Grandfather's goal of this trek was for Marinette to die. Everything Marinette had done that Grandfather directly ordered her to complete was for the express purpose of her death. And Marinette knew that despite having either a guard or a tutor with her at all times, if she happened to get injured during a training session, they were ordered to let her succumb to her injuries or deal with them herself. Hence her only having been to the hospital wing once in her life, despite the numerous injuries and scars she had acquired. But in the face of all that, there was always a small part of her, so deeply embedded, that just wanted to prove to her grandfather that she was worthy, that despite not being the heir he wanted, she wasn't useless. She was not unworthy of her name and her blood, not like he constantly told her she was. And when she returned to Grandfather's throne room hours later, having completed the task, Grandfather only pinched his lips and furrowed his brow before ordering her to go to her room without dinner because, "If you can trek the mountain, you are able to go without food." She thought she proved herself. The glorious moments between the removal of her blindfold and her entrance of Grandfather's throne room were filled with fantasies of Grandfather finally recognizing her as someone valuable, significant. She didn't understand why he was punishing her with no dinner. Marinette only now realized that his mind would never change. If she was going to prove herself to not be worthless, he would make her worthless. Looking back, Marinette could guess that at that time the baby was in the incubator and they were just waiting to see if it was a boy. Maybe Grandfather was trying to get rid of her early. Marinette shut her mind off of those thoughts. Those thoughts would only get distracted. Distractions will get you killed, and started going down the mountain. There was a little, major, difference between this trek down the mountain and the trek from the exercise 1 month ago. Last time she had proper clothing and gear. Last month's trek found her in layers of waterproof snow gear and many tools. including ropes and an ice axe, all of which she desperately wished she had right now. This time, she was only dressed in simple robes, ones that tied around her waist and fell to the knees, and was wearing some nice fleece trousers underneath, all typically worn by patients in the medical unit. They may be warm in the slight chill of the medical ward, but certainly not warm now. Marinette also learned very quickly that if anything remotely warm touches the snow, that snow will melt. And say that remotely warm thing was fabric. Said fabric will absorb that melted snow, and know that wet fabric will not be warm. It will be just as cold as the snow. The only difference being that the bitter coldness is now on your skin, and felt like thousands of tiny sewing needles pricking your skin at the same time, over and over and over again, though she was incredibly fortunate that she was wearing boots. Regardless of where you were at or what rank you were, you would always have to wear a pair of black combat boots. And said black combat boots were skin tight around her calves, meaning no snow were getting into her boots, and all that warmth was being held in her feet. Small comforts make a huge difference. It also reduces the chance of her losing a toe to frostbite, though such a small comfort did not save her fingers, which were tucked under her arms when she did not need her hands to help her down the mountain. Another thing Marinette was grateful for was the route she had memorized only had 1 mile of snowy terrain before the snow ended and rocks began. From here was a bit more dangerous, and still incredibly cold, but she no longer had to feel the snow on her skin walking down the mountain, and she still remembered in vivid detail how to get down the mountain from this exact point. So definitely the better of the two evils in her opinion. After passing the snowy landscape, the rest of the trek was not too bad, despite it technically being more hazardous. Though, she did feel her hands get scraped from holding rocks and her nails being chipped back, and upon bringing them to her lips to suck on, she noticed the metallic taste of blood. She had gloves on her last trek, so this was a different experience. But all in all, the trek was exactly as she remembered it, though she did encounter a slight issue pertaining to an incident where she walked a little to the right of the path and ended up slipping only a couple of feet. This wouldn't be an issue if her boot hadn't caught and half the sole was torn off, which led her to ditching that boot, because a boot that constantly made a flop as you were trying to climb down a mountain while being unable to see was distracting, which led her to ditch the other boot because having one boot on and not another was distracting as well. And at this point, she had passed all snow and the jagged rock areas, so it wasn't likely for her to come in contact with something that would hurt her. Now, Marinette had been following a narrow path down to where she knew the meadow was. It was like a halfway prize last time. It had a little stream with fresh water, and there was a big empty field filled with some of the most gorgeous flowers she had ever seen, and a nice wooded area off to the other end. She couldn't remember it all that well. Her tutor had given her a 2-minute break to check all her supplies before putting back on her blindfold and start the trek back up the mountain. This time, well, it wasn't like she was going back up the mountain. It was about what she estimated to be an hour or so after she lost her boots that she felt it, like little feathers tickling her feet, going in between her toes as if to attempt to make her laugh. Grass. The meadow. She remembered the lilies and daffodils and tulips, along with an untold number of other flowers that decorated the pasture. She remembered stealing glances at it in between checking all her pockets and bags for the necessary supplies. She remembered the thought of running in that field, the thought of diving into those flowers, smelling all their wonderful scents, seeing all the wonderful colors that blended together in the most gorgeous display of a rainbow she had ever observed. She had dreamed of seeing the meadow again. She had only gotten a whiff of the sweet aroma, but her mind took that whiff and manifested what it could possibly have smelt like in the forms of dreams. Oh, how she loved those dreams! She loved imagining the array of colors and what it might be like to see them again in all their glory. Those few peeks she got on her first trek were the most beautiful of her life. And as she reached up to her face to grab at the blindfold, to see those beautiful flowers, all she felt was the marred skin around her eyes, and the fantasy fell. The dreams crumbled. because this wasn't a trek with a blindfold on so she could see the flowers of the meadow. Her eyes were no longer the bright blue that they once were. They were now cloudy white. Her eyes were broken. She wasn't taking the trek down the mountain for the sake of seeing the meadow once more. She was banished from the League. She had nowhere. She had nothing. She had no one. She didn't even have sight. The nearest village was miles away, and the only reason she had managed to get down the mountain before was due to her intense knowledge of the mountain route from her previous trek. And now she had nothing. Tears started to form in her eyes and... No, it's okay. She would make it. Okay, there was a stream around here. It's a small stream, but it was something. Marinette rose her right foot, moving it slightly forward, and gently laid it down, testing the ground, still feeling the light tickling of grass on her soles. And with a few more steps, her confidence grew. A small smile grew across her face. Maybe I can do this. And as the steps grew more confident, starting to gain speed, and she let out a small giggle, feeling the brush of the flowers against her trousers. Only then did her foot catch against a small hole she had not anticipated, and fell to the ground, not even having time to put her arms out in front of her, falling straight onto her face. She felt a throbbing sensation in her nose and felt blood dripping down it. Bruised or broken. She wasn't sure if it was her sudden remembrance of the cold clothing, or the blindness, or the bleeding nose that was the cause. But the next thing she knew, she was breaking down into loud, heavy sobs. She couldn't control them. Everything was going wrong. Marinette started to dig her hands into a fist and making an effort to crawl. She wasn't really sure that in between the sobs that were so strong they were causing issues with her breathing, or how she needed to avoid busting her nose again by getting her foot stuck into another hole. But she couldn't really focus on anything, let alone her crawling. She was trying to find her way to the stream, trying to hear the sound of running water over her own sobs. Calming herself down and stopping the crying was not working. She had never cried like this before, not even when she first woke up and realized her eyes weren't working, not when she found out her eyes would be broken forever, not when she was first thrown out of the gates of Nandam Part. And even though she was able to stop shedding actual tears, it seems like her lungs didn't get the message. They were still panting faster and deeper than they did when she would run, and they were not doing their job of taking in air, causing her to give little pitiful huffs in an effort to breathe. Despite the tears having stopped, she felt them come flooding back when her finger brushed against a rough surface. A root, meaning trees. And while she only got a few glimpses of the meadow, she memorized what she saw. There was a little stream off to the left, and a huge meadow filled with flowers, and a couple hundred deep into the meadow, on the opposite side of the field, lay the forest, meaning the entire time she was trying to find the stream for a drink going the opposite direction. The cries were even harsher than before. She was starting to guide her hands up the tree in an attempt to get some form of stability, while the sobs racked her entire body. I can't do this. I can't find water. I can't even walk. The tears continued to grow louder and thicker with each thought. She was climbing her hands up the tree, and upon putting her second foot firm on the ground, it slipped and she fell back on the ground, the feeling of mud seeping through her trousers making her even dirtier than she already was, if that was even possible. The mud bled between her toes, an echo of the grass that was once tickling them, only making her cry harder. She made a second attempt to balance, and put her foot back down on the ground, holding the tree even tighter than before. The sobs kept coming, and with the tears came a realization. One truly horrid realization. The realization stopped the loud tears, and the panting lungs. She fixed her last foot down, leaning her forehead against the tree. The single thought, the petrifying realization ringing through her head, repeating over and over again, I'm going to die. And a single tear rolled over the scarred skin of her eyes and fell. As it made contact with the mud beneath Marinette's feet, it was as if the whole world had exploded, and she could see everything.